History's warning for contemporary democracy. The tactics Adolf Hitler used to destroy German democracy in the 1930s were not unique products of their time. They represent a reproducible blueprint for authoritarian takeover that continues to threaten democratic societies today. Across the globe, we are witnessing the alarming resurgence of manufactured crisis as a tool for political control, from Hungary's Viktor Orban exploiting migration fears to justify constitutional changes, to India's Narendra Modi using religious tensions to consolidate power, to various leaders worldwide claiming electoral fraud to undermine democratic legitimacy. In the United States, the parallels have become particularly stark. The events of January 6, 2021, when supporters of then President Donald Trump stormed the Capitol building based on manufactured claims of electoral fraud, echo Hitler's failed beer hall putsch, attempted coup. Like Hitler's subsequent legal strategy, contemporary authoritarians have learned to weaponize democratic institutions against democracy itself, using voter suppression laws, gerrymandering, and judicial appointments to achieve through legal means what direct force cannot accomplish. The systematic undermining of shared truth through propaganda, what we now call alternative facts and fake news, mirrors the Nazi information warfare that made rational democratic debate impossible. The normalization of political violence, the corruption of law enforcement and judicial systems, and the creation of false choices between authoritarian order and democratic chaos are being replayed across multiple democracies with frightening precision. Understanding Hitler's methodical destruction of the Weimar Republic is not merely an academic exercise, it is an urgent manual for recognizing and resisting similar threats in our own time. The techniques may be updated for the digital age, but the fundamental strategy remains unchanged. Manufacture crisis, exploit fear, and convince citizens to surrender their freedoms voluntarily in exchange for the illusion of security and order. The calculated chaos of authoritarian ascent. The rise of Adolf Hitler represents one of history's most devastating examples of how manufactured crises can be weaponized to destroy democratic institutions. Through a carefully orchestrated campaign of violence, propaganda, and political manipulation, Hitler and the Nazi Party created the very disorder they claimed to solve, ultimately using the pretext of restoring public order to dismantle the Weimar Republic and establish a totalitarian state. This process began in Bavaria and expanded systematically across Germany, revealing a blueprint for authoritarian takeover that remains chillingly relevant, especially recently. Early foundations, the Munich Putsch and lessons in failure. Hitler's understanding of crisis manipulation began with his failed beer hall putsch in Munich on November 8th to 9th, 1923. This early attempt at seizing power through direct force ended in disaster, with Hitler arrested and tried for treason. However, the failed coup taught him crucial lessons about the limitations of violent insurrection and the power of propaganda and legal maneuvering. During his trial, Hitler transformed the courtroom into a platform for his ideology, using the proceedings to spread his message and portray himself as a patriotic martyr. More importantly, he observed how the Bavarian government's response to the putsch, harsh but ultimately limited, demonstrated both the fragility of democratic institutions and the potential for exploiting public fears about political instability. The putsch's failure convinced Hitler that power must be seized through ostensibly legal means, but it also revealed how manufactured crises could be used to justify extraordinary measures. The Nazi Party's subsequent strategy would center on creating situations that appeared to threaten public order, then positioning themselves as the only force capable of restoring stability. The Bavarian Laboratory, testing ground for authoritarian tactics. Bavaria became Hitler's proving ground for perfecting the art of manufactured crisis. The state's political landscape in the 1920s was characterized by genuine economic hardship, political fragmentation, and social tensions that the Nazis expertly exploited and amplified, creating disorder through street violence. The SA, Sturmabteilung, or brown shirts, became Hitler's primary instrument for manufacturing disorder. These paramilitary units, ostensibly formed for protection of Nazi rallies, systematically provoked confrontations with political opponents, particularly social democrats and communists. The strategy was deliberately calculated. SA members would instigate violence at opposition meetings or in working class neighborhoods, then claim they were defending themselves against Marxist aggression. This structuring can just as easily be used with words like woke. This tactic served multiple purposes. First, it created genuine public disorder that could be documented and publicized. Second, it positioned the Nazis as both victims of political violence and as the only force willing to fight back against it. Third, it demonstrated the alleged inability of democratic authorities to maintain order, undermining public confidence in the Weimar government. The SA's activities in Bavaria followed a consistent pattern. They would target specific neighborhoods or events, often coordinating attacks to occur simultaneously across multiple locations. This created an impression of widespread organized violence that was actually Nazi manufactured chaos. Local newspapers, often sympathetic to right wing causes, cough cough, would report these incidents as evidence of growing leftist militancy, rarely investigating the Nazi role in provoking the confrontations. Exploiting economic desperation. Hitler's team proved masterful at connecting economic hardship to political scapegoating. Bavaria, like much of Germany, suffered from hyperinflation, unemployment, and economic instability throughout the 1920s. Rather than addressing these issues through policy proposals, the Nazis used them as fuel for their crisis narrative. They organized rallies in economically depressed areas, promising simple solutions to complex problems while simultaneously blaming Germany's difficulties on internal enemies such as Jews, Marxists, and democratic politicians. When these rallies inevitably led to confrontations with opponents or police, the Nazis portrayed any official response as persecution of patriots trying to save Germany from economic collapse. The party's propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, amplified every incident of disorder, real or manufactured, to support their narrative that only strong leadership could restore stability. They distributed leaflets documenting every street fight, every broken window, every disrupted meeting, creating a drumbeat of crisis that made their authoritarian solutions seem reasonable to frightened citizens. Infiltrating and undermining democratic institutions. Parallel to their street level disorder campaign, the Nazis worked systematically to infiltrate and undermine Bavaria's democratic institutions. They placed sympathizers in police departments, local government offices, and judicial positions. These infiltrators served multiple functions. They could ensure lenient treatment of Nazi violations while strictly enforcing laws against opponents. They provided intelligence about government plans and weaknesses, and they could manipulate official reports to support Nazi narratives about public disorder. This institutional infiltration was crucial to the manufactured crisis strategy. When SA members committed acts of violence, sympathetic police officers might file reports that minimized Nazi responsibility while emphasizing the threat posed by their victims. Judges could impose harsh sentences on anti Nazi protesters while giving suspended sentences to brown shirts convicted of similar offenses. The cumulative effect was a gradual erosion of the rule of law, where official institutions appeared to validate Nazi claims about the dangers of political opposition while demonstrating their own inability to maintain order impartially. The national expansion from Bavaria to Berlin. The tactics perfected in Bavaria became the template for Nazi expansion across Germany. As the party grew in strength and organization, Hitler systematically exported his manufactured crisis model to other states and regions. The Reichstag fire, manufactured crisis on a national scale. The February 27, 1933 Reichstag fire represents the culmination of Hitler's manufactured crisis strategy. While historians continue to debate the exact circumstances of the fire's origin, its political exploitation was immediate and devastating. Within hours, Hitler and the Nazi leadership had framed the incident as part of a communist conspiracy to overthrow the government. The Nazi response revealed the sophisticated machinery of crisis exploitation they had developed. Propaganda outlets immediately began circulating stories of planned communist uprisings across Germany, supported by fabricated documents and coerced confessions. The SA and SS launched coordinated raids on communist and social democratic headquarters, arresting thousands of political opponents under the pretext of preventing revolution. Most crucially, Hitler used the fire to convince President Hindenburg to issue the Reichstag fire decree, which suspended most civil liberties and allowed for indefinite detention without trial. This decree justified as an emergency measure to protect public order, became the legal foundation for Nazi persecution of political opponents. The Enabling Act legitimizing dictatorship through manufactured necessity. The March 1933 passage of the Enabling Act represented the final transformation of manufactured crisis into legal dictatorship. Hitler presented this law, which gave him the power to pass laws without parliamentary approval, as a necessary response to the ongoing communist threat allegedly revealed by the Reichstag fire. The act's passage was itself a masterpiece of manufactured crisis. The Nazis surrounded the Kroll Opera House, temporary home of the Reichstag, with SA and SS troops, creating an atmosphere of intimidation. They arrested enough communist deputies to prevent them from voting, while simultaneously promising moderate parties that the act would only be used in emergencies and would respect existing institutions. The debates surrounding the act revealed how effectively the Nazis had manufactured a sense of crisis. Even politicians who opposed Hitler felt compelled to acknowledge the apparent threat to public order and the need for strong measures to address it. The manufactured disorder of the previous months had created a political environment where extraordinary measures seemed reasonable, even necessary. The propaganda amplification system. The Nazi propaganda machine was crucial to transforming isolated incidents into perceived widespread threats. They understood that the perception of crisis could be more politically powerful than actual crisis, and they invested heavily in creating systems to amplify and distort information about public disorder. Newspapers, radio programs, and public speeches consistently portrayed minor incidents as evidence of major threats. A single street fight between Nazis and communists would be reported as part of a coordinated attack on German civilization. Economic problems would be described as deliberate sabotage by internal enemies. Political opposition would be characterized as treason against the German people. This propaganda system created what scholars now recognize as an information cascade, where false or exaggerated claims about crisis gain credibility through repetition and apparent confirmation from multiple sources. Citizens who might have been skeptical of individual Nazi claims found themselves overwhelmed by the apparent weight of evidence for widespread disorder and the need for strong leadership. The false choice strategy. This manufactured crisis strategy depended on creating false choices between Nazi authority and chaos by simultaneously creating disorder and positioning themselves as the only alternative to it. The Nazis eliminated moderate options from public discourse. Democratic politicians found themselves trapped between acknowledging the reality of public disorder, which validated Nazi claims, and denying it, which made them appear out of touch with public concerns. Attempts to address the disorder through normal democratic processes, such as through investigation, debate, and compromise, were portrayed as weakness. Today, we would hear soft on crime. This false choice strategy was particularly effective because it exploited genuine public desires for stability and order. Citizens who had no sympathy for Nazi ideology might still support Nazi solutions if they believed the alternatives were chaos, the legal legitimization process. Perhaps most dangerously, Hitler's manufactured crisis strategy was designed to make authoritarian measures appear legally and constitutionally justified. Rather than openly rejecting democratic norms, the Nazis used crises to create situations where extraordinary measures seemed necessary within existing legal frameworks. The Reichstag fire decree and the Enabling Act were both passed through legal processes, however manipulated. This legal veneer was crucial to gaining acceptance from conservative politicians, civil servants, and citizens who might have opposed an obviously illegal seizure of power. The manufactured nature of the crises that justified these measures was obscured by their legal form. Citizens could tell themselves that they were supporting emergency measures to protect democracy, not participating in its destruction. Nazi leadership also understood that external threats could be used to justify internal repression, while internal disorder could be used to justify an aggressive foreign policy. The 1938 Sudetenland crisis revealed how Hitler's manufactured crisis techniques could be applied to international relations. The Nazi leadership organized and funded ethnic German groups in Czechoslovakia to create incidents that could be portrayed as persecution of German minorities. These manufactured incidents served multiple purposes. They provided justification for German intervention. They created genuine instability that weakened the Czechoslovak state, and they demonstrated to other countries with German minorities the consequences of opposing Nazi demands. The international community's response to the Sudetenland crisis, accepting Hitler's claims about ethnic persecution and agreeing to territorial changes to preserve peace, validated the effectiveness of manufactured crisis as a tool of international politics, the systematic destruction of democratic norms. The Nazi propaganda system made factual disagreement about basic realities a permanent feature of German political life. Citizens could no longer agree on whether reported incidents of disorder were real or manufactured, whether the threats to public safety were genuine or exaggerated, or whether the government's responses were proportionate or excessive. This erosion of shared truth made democratic debate impossible. When citizens cannot agree on basic facts about their political situation, they cannot engage in the kind of rational deliberation that democracy requires. The Nazis deliberately fostered this confusion, understanding that citizens who could not determine what was true would be more likely to support leaders who claimed to provide certainty. Normalization of violence. The manufactured crisis strategy required the gradual normalization of political violence. Citizens had to become accustomed to seeing street fights, mass arrests, and paramilitary demonstrations as normal features of political life. This normalization process was carefully managed. The essay's violence was initially portrayed as defensive, then as necessary for maintaining order, and finally as patriotic service to the German people. Citizens who might have been shocked by political violence in 1925 had learned to accept it as inevitable by 1933. The normalization of violence was crucial to the success of the manufactured crisis strategy because it made citizens more receptive to authoritarian solutions. When violence becomes normal, strong leadership appears necessary rather than oppressive. Lessons for democratic resilience. Hitler's successful use of manufactured crisis to destroy German democracy offers crucial lessons for understanding and preventing authoritarian takeover in contemporary contexts. Democratic institutions must maintain their integrity and independence even during genuine crises. Hitler's strategy depended on infiltrating and corrupting these institutions, making them unable to provide accurate information or impartial enforcement of laws. Modern democracies must develop robust safeguards against institutional capture, including strong ethical standards, independent oversight mechanisms, and diverse leadership structures that resist coordination by authoritarian movements, media literacy, and information verification. The Nazi propaganda system succeeded because citizens lacked the tools and knowledge to verify information about political events. Modern democracies must invest in media literacy education and develop reliable systems for fact checking and information verification. Citizens must understand how propaganda works, how false information spreads, and how to identify reliable sources of news and analysis. Without these skills, they remain vulnerable to manufactured crisis narratives designed to justify authoritarian measures and the dribble of podcast bros. Um, Early recognition and response. The most important lesson from Hitler's rise may be the need for early recognition and response to manufactured crisis strategies. By the time the Nazis were openly destroying democratic institutions, their manufactured crisis narrative had already made resistance appear futile or dangerous. Democratic societies must develop the capacity to recognize manufactured crisis campaigns in their early stages, when they can still be countered through democratic means. This requires vigilance from citizens, journalists, and political leaders, as well as institutional mechanisms for rapid response to authoritarian threats. The enduring threat of manufactured crisis. Hitler's transformation from failed putschist to dictator reveals the devastating effectiveness of manufactured crisis as a tool of authoritarian takeover. His success in Bavaria and expansion across Germany demonstrated how democratic societies can be manipulated into accepting the destruction of their own freedoms through carefully orchestrated campaigns of disorder and fear. The Nazi strategy of manufacturing crises to justify authoritarian responses was not unique to 1930s Germany. Similar patterns can be observed in authoritarian takeovers throughout history and around the world. Understanding these patterns is crucial for protecting democratic institutions and values in contemporary contexts. The ultimate tragedy of Hitler's rise was not that he seized power through force, but that he convinced millions of Germans to hand it to him voluntarily. They believed they were choosing order over chaos, strength over weakness, decisive leadership over democratic ineffectiveness. They did not realize they were choosing manufactured crisis over genuine democracy, authoritarian manipulation over truthful governance. The preservation of democratic society requires constant vigilance against those who would manufacture crises to justify the destruction of democratic norms. Citizens must remain skeptical of leaders who claim that extraordinary problems require extraordinary solutions, who argue that democratic processes are too slow or weak to address urgent threats, who present themselves as the only alternative to chaos and disorder. Hitler's rise reminds us that democracy is not just a system of government, but a way of life that requires active participation and protection from all citizens. The price of freedom remains eternal vigilance, particularly against those who would use our fears and desires for order to convince us to surrender the very freedoms that make democratic life possible. In an age of global communication, social media manipulation, and political polarization, the tools available for manufacturing crisis have become more sophisticated and far reaching than anything Hitler could have imagined. Yet the fundamental strategy remains the same: create disorder, blame opponents, position yourself as the solution, and use the resulting crisis to justify the destruction of democratic institutions. Understanding Hitler's use of manufactured crisis is not just a matter of historical interest, it is an essential tool for protecting democratic societies from similar threats in the present and future. The stakes could not be higher, and the lessons could not be more clear.